Picture this: you're standing in a room full of successful people, watching something valuable slip away for almost nothing, and everyone around you is frozen in fear or indifference. The auctioneer's voice echoes through the silence, counting down the final moments. Your heart pounds as you realize this could be the chance of a lifetime, but only if you have the courage to raise your hand when everyone else won't. This is the story of how one moment of boldness in a silent room changed everything. It's about seeing opportunity where others see only risk, about having the nerve to act when the crowd chooses to watch, and about how sometimes the best decisions happen when the stakes feel impossibly high. What you're about to read isn't just a story about an auction. It's about the moments that define us, the chances we take, and the unexpected ways life rewards those brave enough to step forward when everyone else steps back. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty parking lot of the county courthouse as Jake Martinez adjusted his worn leather hat and checked his watch. He had driven 3 hours from his ranch in Cedar Valley to attend this foreclosure auction, not because he had money to spend, but because his banker had mentioned it might be worth watching. The property going up for sale was the old Henderson Ranch, a sprawling piece of land that had been in the same family for 4 generations until bad luck and worse decisions finally caught up with them. Jake had known old Frank Henderson since he was a boy. His father used to trade cattle with Frank's father, and the two families had maintained a respectful friendship despite being competitors in the same business. When Frank's health started failing 3 years ago, Jake had watched from a distance as the ranch began to crumble. First, Frank's son Tommy took over, but Tommy had more interest in gambling than ranching. Then came the drought that lasted 2 summers, followed by the disease that wiped out half their cattle herd. The final blow came when Tommy borrowed heavily against the land to try one last desperate venture in oil speculation that went nowhere. Now, as Jake walked toward the courthouse steps where a small crowd had gathered, he couldn't help but feel a mix of sadness and anticipation. The Henderson Ranch wasn't just any piece of property. It sat right between Jake's land and the main highway, with access to the best water rights in the county and soil that could grow anything if you knew how to work it. More importantly, it had something Jake needed desperately: a processing facility that would allow him to take his organic beef operation to the next level without the massive startup costs of building his own. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that carried further than his small frame suggested, was setting up his podium on the courthouse steps. Around him, about 30 people milled about, most of them looking like they were there more out of curiosity than serious intent to bid. Jake recognized several local ranchers, a few real estate developers from the city, and some folks he couldn't place who might have been investors or just neighbors wanting to see how the story ended. Jake pulled out the folded papers from his shirt pocket and reviewed them one more time. His banker, Sarah Chen, had been cautious but encouraging when he'd brought up the idea of bidding. The ranch was being sold to satisfy a debt of $800,000, which meant the bidding would start there. Sarah had pre-approved Jake for a loan up to $1.2 million, but only because his own ranch was debt-free and profitable. Even so, she had warned him that this kind of expansion was risky, especially in an uncertain agricultural market. As the crowd began to settle, Jake noticed a familiar face near the front. It was Marcus Webb, a wealthy businessman from Dallas who had been buying up ranch land throughout the region for the past 5 years. Marcus wasn't a rancher himself, but he had deep pockets and a reputation for turning agricultural land into hunting preserves for wealthy clients. If Marcus was here, Jake knew the bidding might go higher than he could afford. The auctioneer called for attention and began his rapid-fire explanation of the terms. The property would be sold as is, with all mineral rights included, and the successful bidder would need to provide a cashier's check for 10% of the winning bid amount within 1 hour of the auction's end. The remaining balance would be due within 30 days. Jake felt his palms sweat slightly as he thought about the cashier's check already folded in his wallet, representing every dollar of liquid cash he could scrape together. When the bidding began, Jake was surprised by how quickly it escalated. Marcus Webb opened with $850,000, immediately raising the stakes above the minimum debt amount. A real estate developer Jake didn't recognize countered with $900,000. Another voice from the back called out $925,000. Jake held back, remembering Sarah's advice to let others establish the price range before jumping in. The bidding continued in $25,000 increments, and Jake watched as the crowd began to thin out psychologically. Some people who had looked serious earlier now stepped back with resigned expressions. Others checked their phones or whispered to companions, clearly calculating whether this was still worth their time. By the time the price reached $1 million, only 4 bidders remained active: Marcus Webb, the real estate developer, an older man Jake didn't recognize, and a woman who appeared to be representing someone by phone. At $1,100,000, the woman ended her phone call and shook her head at the auctioneer. The older man dropped out at $1,125,000, leaving only Marcus and the developer. Jake felt his heart rate increase as he realized this might be his moment to enter the bidding, but the price was already pushing against his upper limit. The developer pushed the bid to $1,150,000, and Marcus countered immediately with $1,175,000. The two men locked eyes for a moment, and Jake could sense the tension building. The developer hesitated, looked at his notes, and then surprised everyone by shaking his head and stepping back from the crowd. Now it was just Marcus Webb and whatever ghost bidders might still be in the crowd. The auctioneer called for $1,200,000, scanning the crowd for any signs of interest. This was Jake's absolute ceiling, the maximum amount his bank had approved. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. If he bid now and won, he would be committing himself and his family's future to a massive expansion that could either set them up for life or destroy everything he had built. Marcus Webb raised his hand, and the auctioneer acknowledged $1,200,000. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses in bidding. This felt final, like the moment when everyone collectively decides that the price has gone beyond reason. Jake looked around at the faces in the crowd and saw resignation, disappointment, and relief in various combinations. The auctioneer began his closing call. "I have $1,200,000 from bidder number 17. Looking for $1,225,000. Do I hear $1,225,000? His voice carried across the parking lot, but no hands went up. Several people began to move toward their cars, apparently satisfied that the show was over. Going once at $1,200,000, the auctioneer continued, his rhythm building toward the inevitable conclusion. Jake felt something strange happening in his chest, a combination of regret and possibility that made it hard to breathe normally. He thought about his wife Maria and their 2 children, about the modest but comfortable life they had built on his family's ranch. He thought about the dreams they had discussed over dinner, plans for expanding their operation, sending the kids to college without debt, maybe even taking a real vacation someday. Going twice at $1,200,000, the auctioneer called out, and Jake could hear the finality creeping into his voice. In a few seconds, it would be over, and Marcus Webb would own the Henderson Ranch. It would become another hunting preserve, the processing facility would probably be torn down, and Jake would go back to his smaller operation, always wondering what might have been. But then, Jake thought about something else. He remembered a conversation with old Frank Henderson from 2 years ago, when Frank had stopped by to look at some cattle Jake was selling. Frank had been worried about Tommy's management of the ranch, and he'd mentioned something that stuck with Jake even now. The Henderson Ranch had an old survey from the 1970s that showed potential oil deposits in the southwestern section, deposits that had never been explored because the technology wasn't cost-effective at the time. Jake had forgotten about that conversation until this moment, but now it came flooding back with startling clarity. Frank had shown him a copy of the geological survey, pointing out the areas where seismic testing had indicated possible oil-bearing formations. At the time, oil prices were low and drilling technology was expensive, so the Henderson family had focused on ranching instead. But now, with new horizontal drilling techniques and higher oil prices, those old surveys might be worth revisiting. The auctioneer was drawing breath for his final call when Jake felt his hand begin to rise almost without his conscious decision. The crowd stayed silent, but Jake could feel every eye turning toward him as his hand went up. His voice came out stronger than he expected when he called out, $1,225,000. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Marcus Webb spun around to see who had entered the bidding so late in the game, his face showing a mixture of surprise and annoyance. Several people who had been walking toward their cars stopped and turned back toward the courthouse steps. The auctioneer smiled and acknowledged Jake's bid with obvious satisfaction, knowing that a last-minute bidding war would mean more money for his client. Marcus Webb didn't hesitate long. Within seconds, he raised his hand again and called out, $1,250,000. The crowd murmured appreciatively, sensing that the real auction was just beginning. Jake felt a moment of panic as he realized he was already beyond his approved loan amount, but then he remembered something else Sarah Chen had mentioned. If the property had significant oil potential, the bank might consider additional financing based on the mineral rights as collateral. Jake looked at Marcus Webb, trying to read the man's face for signs of how high he was willing to go. Marcus owned several other properties in the region and had money to burn, but he also had a reputation for being shrewd about his investments. He wouldn't bid indefinitely if he thought the price was getting unreasonable. The question was, what did Marcus consider unreasonable for this particular property? The auctioneer called for $1,275,000, and the crowd held its breath waiting for Jake's response. This was the moment of truth, the point where Jake would either commit fully to this leap of faith or step back and let Marcus Webb have the property. He thought about Maria again, about the promise he had made to her when they got married that he would never risk their security on a gamble. But this didn't feel like a gamble anymore. It felt like the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime, the kind of decision that separates those who dream from those who achieve. Jake raised his hand and heard his own voice call out the bid that would change everything. Marcus Webb's face darkened as he realized he was now in a serious bidding war with someone he hadn't expected to be a real competitor. The wealthy Dallas businessman had done his homework on the Henderson Ranch, and he knew exactly what he was willing to pay for it. More importantly, he thought he knew who all the serious bidders would be, and Jake Martinez hadn't been on that list. Jake could feel the weight of every eye in the crowd as the bidding continued to escalate. At $1,300,000, he was already $50,000 beyond his approved loan limit, but something told him to keep going. Maybe it was the memory of Frank Henderson's geological survey, or maybe it was the look of surprised respect he saw in several faces around him, but Jake felt more confident with each bid than he had any right to feel. The real estate developer who had dropped out earlier was now watching with renewed interest, clearly curious about what Jake knew that others didn't. A few people had pulled out their phones and were making quiet calls, probably to spouses or business partners, updating them on the unexpected turn the auction had taken. The auctioneer was practically glowing with satisfaction as the bids continued to climb well beyond what anyone had predicted. Marcus Webb bid $1,325,000, and Jake countered with $1,350,000 without hesitation. He was now operating purely on instinct and faith, trusting that somehow the numbers would work out if his hunch about the property's potential proved correct. Maria would have his head if she knew what he was doing, but Jake had learned over the years that sometimes you have to take calculated risks to build something meaningful. What Jake didn't know was that Marcus Webb was starting to question his own assumptions about the property. Marcus had planned to bid up to $1,400,000, based on his analysis of the land's value as a hunting preserve and investment property. But Jake's aggressive bidding suggested that the cowboy might know something Marcus didn't. In the high-stakes world of property acquisition, information was everything, and Marcus was beginning to wonder if he had missed something important in his due diligence. At $1,400,000, Marcus Webb paused for the first time since the serious bidding had begun. Jake saw the hesitation and felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. He was now $300,000 beyond his approved loan amount, betting everything on a geological survey from the 1970s and his gut feeling about Frank Henderson's honesty. If he was wrong, he could lose not just this opportunity, but potentially his own ranch as well. The auctioneer called for $1,425,000, and the silence stretched longer than it had all morning. Marcus Webb was clearly doing calculations in his head, weighing the value of the property against the risk of overpaying. Jake used the pause to scan the crowd again, looking for any sign of other potential bidders who might jump back in at this level. That's when he noticed something interesting. Tommy Henderson, Frank's son whose gambling debts had led to this foreclosure, was standing at the back of the crowd with tears in his eyes. Jake had seen Tommy around town over the past few months, and he looked like a man carrying the weight of enormous guilt. Losing the family ranch had clearly devastated him, but there was something else in his expression now, something that looked almost like hope. Jake made a quick decision that would prove crucial. During the pause in bidding, he walked over to Tommy Henderson and spoke quietly. "Tommy, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me. That geological survey your father showed me a couple years ago, the one about possible oil deposits, do you remember it?" Tommy's eyes widened with surprise. "You mean the old Texaco survey from 1976? Dad always said there might be oil in the southwest section, but it was never worth exploring back then. Why? Do you still have copies of that survey?" Jake asked, his heart pounding. "Yeah, they're in the ranch office. Dad kept everything." "Jake, are you thinking about bidding on this place because of that old survey?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, but Jake could hear the excitement building. "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But I need to know, is there anything else about that land that your father might have mentioned? Anything that made him think the oil potential was real?" Tommy looked around nervously, then leaned closer to Jake. "Last year, before everything went to hell, Dad hired a private geologist to update that old survey. Cost him $5,000 he couldn't afford, but he was desperate to find some way to save the ranch. The geologist said the formations looked promising, especially with the new drilling techniques, but Dad died before he could do anything about it." Jake felt his blood pressure spike. "Where's that updated survey, Tommy?" "It's with all the other papers in Dad's office." "Jake, if you're serious about this, and if there really is oil on that land, maybe some good can come out of this mess. Dad always liked your family. He'd be happy knowing the land went to someone who would take care of it." Jake walked back to his position in the crowd with his mind racing. An updated geological survey that confirmed oil potential changed everything. Even if he had to go beyond his current loan approval, the bank would almost certainly approve additional financing if he could prove the property had significant mineral value. The risk was still enormous, but it was no longer blind gambling. Marcus Webb had decided to bid $1,425,000. Jake could see the determination in the businessman's face, but he could also see something else: doubt. Marcus was no longer bidding with the confidence of someone who knew he was getting a good deal. He was bidding like someone who was afraid of missing out on something he didn't fully understand. Jake raised his hand immediately and called out, $1,450,000. The crowd let out a collective gasp, and Jake heard someone behind him whisper that Cowboy's lost his mind. Maybe he had lost his mind, but Jake was committed now. He was betting not just on the oil potential, but on his ability to make the ranch profitable even without oil. The processing facility alone was worth at least $200,000, and the water rights were invaluable in a region that seemed to get drier every year. Even if the oil surveys proved worthless, he could still make this work if he was smart and worked hard. Marcus Webb was now showing visible signs of frustration. He had expected to acquire the Henderson Ranch for a reasonable price, not to get into a bidding war that pushed the property value to nearly double what he had originally planned to spend. At $1,500,000, his investment math no longer worked for a hunting preserve operation. The auctioneer called for $1,475,000, and Marcus Webb hesitated longer than he had all morning. Jake could practically see the internal debate playing out on the man's face. Finally, Marcus shook his head slightly and stepped back from the crowd. He was done. But Jake's relief was short-lived, because at that moment, a new voice called out from the crowd. $1,475,000. Jake spun around to see who had entered the bidding so late in the game, and his heart sank when he saw a well-dressed woman he didn't recognize raising her hand. She had the look of someone who represented serious money, probably another out-of-state investor who had been waiting to see how high the local bidders would push the price. The auctioneer acknowledged the new bid with obvious delight. A three-way bidding war would drive the price even higher, and his commission was calculated as a percentage of the final sale amount. Jake felt a moment of despair as he realized he might be facing someone with deeper pockets than Marcus Webb. The woman's name was Catherine Morrison, and she represented a consortium of investors from Houston who specialized in acquiring undervalued agricultural properties with development potential. She had been watching the bidding carefully, trying to determine whether the high bids reflected genuine property value or just an emotional bidding war between local rivals. When Marcus Webb dropped out, she decided the property might actually be worth the inflated price. Jake didn't know any of this, but he could see the professional competence in Catherine Morrison's demeanor. She wasn't bidding with emotion or desperation. She was bidding with the cool calculation of someone who had done this many times before. That made her more dangerous than Marcus Webb had ever been. The bidding continued in $25,000 increments, and Jake watched his financial cushion disappear completely. At $1,500,000, he was betting everything he owned and everything he could borrow on a property that might or might not contain oil. The processing facility and water rights were valuable, but not valuable enough to justify this price on their own. Catherine Morrison bid $1,525,000, and Jake felt the moment of truth approaching. This was probably his last realistic chance to bid before the price went completely beyond any rational justification. He thought about Maria and the kids, about the life they had built together, and about the dreams they shared for the future. Then, he thought about something else his father had told him years ago. "Son," the old man had said, "there are times in life when playing it safe is the biggest risk of all. The world doesn't reward people who are afraid to bet on themselves when the opportunity is right." Jake raised his hand one more time and called out, $1,550,000. The crowd had gone completely silent now, watching this drama play out between a local rancher and a professional investor. Even the auctioneer seemed to sense that they had reached the climactic moment of the entire auction. Catherine Morrison looked at Jake with new respect, clearly reassessing her assumptions about the small-town cowboy who was pushing her to her limit. She made a quick phone call, spoke in whispers for about 30 seconds, then ended the call and looked directly at the auctioneer. $1,600,000, she said clearly, and Jake felt his world shift beneath his feet. Jake stood in the courthouse parking lot feeling like he had just been punched in the stomach. $1,600,000 was beyond anything he could possibly justify, even with the most optimistic projections about oil potential. The rational part of his mind was telling him to walk away, to accept that he had given it his best shot but been outbid by someone with deeper pockets. But, as he looked around at the faces in the crowd, Jake saw something unexpected. Instead of the resignation or relief he might have expected, he saw disappointment. These were his neighbors, people who had watched his family ranch for generations, and they seemed genuinely upset that he might lose out to another outside investor. Tommy Henderson was watching from the back with obvious anguish, clearly hoping that Jake would find a way to keep bidding. The auctioneer called for $1,625,000, and the silence felt different this time. It wasn't the silence of a concluded auction, but the silence of a community holding its breath, waiting to see if their local champion would find the courage for one more bid. Jake closed his eyes and tried to think clearly about his options. That's when he remembered something else about his conversation with Sarah Chen at the bank. She had mentioned that the bank's board of directors was interested in supporting local agricultural development, especially projects that could create jobs and keep young people in the community. If Jake could present a solid business plan that included the processing facility and potential oil revenue, the bank might be willing to consider a larger loan than his initial approval. More importantly, Jake realized that he wasn't just bidding on a piece of property anymore. He was bidding on his family's future, his community's future, and his own belief in what was possible when you combined hard work with calculated risk-taking. The geological surveys gave him reason for optimism, but even without oil, he knew he could make the Henderson Ranch profitable if he applied everything he had learned from running his own smaller operation. Jake opened his eyes and looked directly at Catherine Morrison. She was a professional investor, which meant she was probably bidding based on conservative estimates of the property's value. She wouldn't go significantly beyond what her financial models told her was reasonable. Jake, on the other hand, was bidding based on his intimate knowledge of the land, his relationships in the community, and his willingness to work 18-hour days to make his investment pay off. $1,625,000, Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. The crowd stirred appreciatively, and he could see people pulling out their phones to text updates to friends and family who weren't at the auction. This had become more than just a property sale, it had become a story about David and Goliath, about the little guy refusing to back down against corporate money. Catherine Morrison looked surprised by Jake's persistence, but she didn't hesitate to counter with $1,650,000. Jake could see that she was still bidding with confidence, which meant her investors had approved her to go higher than this. The realization was both discouraging and motivating. Jake was outgunned financially, but he wasn't outmatched in determination. At $1,700,000, Jake was so far beyond his original budget that the numbers had started to feel abstract. He was betting everything on the belief that he could make this work through a combination of oil revenue, agricultural income, and the processing facility business. It was the biggest financial risk anyone in his family had ever taken, but it also represented the biggest opportunity any of them had ever had. Catherine Morrison bid $1,725,000, and Jake noticed that she made another quick phone call before bidding. That was a good sign. It meant she was reaching the limits of her pre-approved budget and needed to get permission for higher bids. Professional investors didn't like to exceed their planned investment amounts, even when the opportunity seemed good. Jake bid $1,750,000, and this time Catherine Morrison's phone call lasted longer. Jake couldn't hear what she was saying, but he could see frustration in her body language. When she finished the call, she looked at Jake with something that might have been respect or annoyance. It was hard to tell which. $1,800,000, Catherine Morrison said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Jake sensed that she was approaching her absolute limit, and he decided to test that theory. Without hesitation, Jake called out, $1,825,000. The crowd was completely silent now, watching this financial poker game play out between two determined bidders. Even the auctioneer seemed slightly awed by how high the bidding had gone. Catherine Morrison made one more phone call, and this one was longer than the others. Jake watched her face carefully, looking for any sign of how the conversation was going. When she finally ended the call, she stood quietly for almost a minute, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. Finally, she shook her head and stepped back from the crowd. "I'm done," she said simply, and Jake felt his knees nearly buckle with relief and terror in equal measure. The auctioneer began his closing call. "I have $1,825,000 from bidder number 23. Looking for $1,850,000. Do I hear $1,850,000? He scanned the crowd hopefully, but no hands went up. Catherine Morrison was gathering her papers, clearly finished with the auction. Going once at $1,825,000, the auctioneer called. Jake felt like he might throw up or pass out or both. He had just committed to spending nearly $2 million on a property that he hoped contained oil but wasn't sure about. If he was wrong, this decision could destroy his family's financial security for generations. Going twice at $1,825,000, the auctioneer continued. Jake looked around the crowd and saw Tommy Henderson watching with tears streaming down his face. The young man had lost his family's ranch due to his own poor decisions, but at least it was going to someone who would respect what his father had built. "Sold," the auctioneer called out, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the entire county. "Sold to bidder number 23 for $1,825,000. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jake found himself surrounded by neighbors congratulating him and slapping him on the back. Several people he barely knew were shaking his hand and telling him how glad they were that the Henderson ranch would stay in local hands. Tommy Henderson pushed through the crowd and grabbed Jake in a fierce hug. "Thank you," Tommy whispered. "Dad would be so happy. Promise me you'll take good care of it." "I promise," Jake said, and he meant it completely. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and financial arrangements. Jake called Sarah Chin at the bank and explained what had happened, emphasizing the geological surveys and his plans for the processing facility. Sarah was initially shocked by the amount, but when Jake described the potential oil revenue and his detailed plans for expanding his beef operation, she agreed to expedite a loan modification request. By sunset that evening, Jake Martinez owned the Henderson Ranch. He stood on the front porch of the old ranch house, looking out over 800 acres of some of the best agricultural land in the county, and tried to process what he had done. The magnitude of his financial commitment was terrifying, but the possibilities were endless. 3 months later, Jake's gamble began to pay off in ways he had never expected. The updated geological survey proved accurate, and a small independent oil company agreed to lease the mineral rights for a signing bonus that covered half of his down payment. The processing facility, once he had it updated and certified, began attracting business from organic ranchers throughout the region who needed access to specialized equipment. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. Catherine Morrison, the investor who had pushed him to his financial limits, called Jake 6 months after the auction. Her consortium was interested in partnering with him on additional agricultural investments in the region, based on their respect for his knowledge of local conditions and his willingness to make bold decisions. "You taught us something at that auction," Catherine told him during their phone conversation. "Sometimes the best investment opportunities go to people who are willing to bet on themselves when everyone else is playing it safe. We'd like to work with someone who has that kind of vision." Jake's expansion of the Henderson Ranch operation created 18 new jobs in the community and helped establish the region as a center for organic beef production. The oil leases provided steady income that allowed him to weather the inevitable ups and downs of agricultural markets. Most importantly, his success inspired other local ranchers to think bigger about their own operations and to consider investments they might have avoided before. 5 years after the auction, Jake Martinez was featured on the cover of a regional business magazine as Rancher of the Year. The article described how his willingness to take a calculated risk had transformed not just his own operation, but the entire local agricultural economy. When asked about the moment he decided to keep bidding against professional investors, Jake smiled and said, "Sometimes you have to trust yourself when nobody else will." The crowd stayed silent, but I had something to say. Tommy Henderson, who had used his connections to help Jake navigate the early challenges of managing the expanded operation, eventually became Jake's ranch manager and slowly rebuilt his reputation in the community. Frank Henderson's old ranch house was restored and turned into a visitor center that educated people about sustainable agriculture and the history of ranching in the region. Maria Martinez, who had initially been terrified by her husband's enormous financial gamble, became one of his strongest supporters as she saw how the expanded operation allowed them to provide college educations for their children and establish a foundation that supported rural education initiatives. She often joked that she married a cautious rancher but ended up with an entrepreneur who happened to raise cattle. The Henderson Ranch auction became a local legend, the story of how a cowboy with more courage than money outbid professional investors and transformed his community in the process. But, for Jake Martinez, the real lesson wasn't about bidding strategies or oil surveys or financial risk management. It was about the importance of believing in yourself when the stakes are high and the outcome is uncertain. Years later, when young ranchers asked him for advice about expanding their operations or taking calculated risks, Jake would tell them about that silent moment in the courthouse parking lot when he had to decide whether to raise his hand one more time. "The crowd stayed silent," he would say, "but that doesn't mean you have to."